Imagine walking into a job interview, knowing deep down that something isn't quite right. You've prepared for days, brushed up on your skills, and dressed your best. But when you step into the office, you feel the judgment in the air. Everyone's eyes are on you, not because you're about to ace this job, but because they're expecting you to fail. That's exactly what happened to one man, a story that starts with humiliation, but ends in the most unexpected way possible. He was a black man in a predominantly white corporate world. From the moment he walked through the door, he could sense something was off. The glances, the smirks, the not-so-subtle whispers among the other employees, all of it made the air thick with discomfort. But still, he held his head high. He wasn't new to this. He had faced prejudice before, but this time was different. This wasn't just subtle racism or microaggressions. This felt deliberate, almost like he was set up to fail from the beginning. The company hired him for a mid-level management position, but the expectations were far from fair. His colleagues were either dismissive or outright hostile, treating him like he was beneath them. His tasks? Impossible. The resources he needed to succeed? Non-existent. It didn't take long for him to realize that he wasn't hired for his skills or qualifications, though he had plenty. No, he was hired to be the office's punching bag, someone to blame when things went wrong. They wanted him to crumble under pressure, to prove their stereotypes right. But what they didn't expect was his resilience. He sat through meetings where his ideas were ignored, only to watch someone else take credit for them later. When things went wrong, fingers pointed in his direction, even if the problems had nothing to do with him. And the worst part, the higher-ups knew what was going on. It was as if they were waiting for him to break, to snap, to walk out the door so they could say, "We gave him a chance, but he couldn't handle it." What they didn't know was that this man wasn't someone who gave up easily. Every insult, every slight, every deliberate attempt to undermine him only made him stronger. He stayed late, worked harder, and learned everything he could about the company, even though they tried to keep him in the dark. While they were trying to set him up for failure, he was quietly planning something no one saw coming. The turning point came during a major presentation. His boss, someone who had made it clear from day one that he didn't think much of him, was supposed to lead the presentation, but something unexpected happened. At the last minute, the boss was suddenly unavailable, and the responsibility fell on him. They thought he would panic, that he would make a fool of himself in front of everyone. But he didn't. Instead, he walked into that boardroom, stood in front of the biggest names in the company, and delivered a presentation that left everyone stunned. He had done his homework. Every slide, every chart, every point he made was flawless. The room was silent as he spoke, not because they were waiting for him to mess up, but because they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Here was the man they had tried to humiliate, standing before them, not just holding his own, but excelling in a way that none of them had anticipated. But that wasn't the end. No, what he did next is what truly shocked everyone. After the presentation, instead of soaking in the praise, he turned the spotlight on the very people who had been trying to bring him down. In a calm, professional manner, he called out the toxic culture, the unfair treatment, and the sabotage that had been going on since his first day. He didn't raise his voice or lose his cool. He simply laid out the truth for everyone to see. What happened next? Well, that's where things take a turn you won't believe. After the meeting, the room remained frozen in stunned silence. No one had expected him to speak up, let alone confront the very people who had done everything in their power to tear him down. He didn't name names directly, but the message was clear. He knew what had been happening. Everyone in that boardroom now knew that he was aware of the games being played, the quiet sabotage, the whispered plans to make him look incompetent. As he calmly returned to his seat, the higher-ups exchanged nervous glances. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, others stared straight ahead, unsure of how to respond. They had been caught, exposed. And it wasn't just about the treatment he had faced, it was about the entire company's toxic culture that had been allowed to fester for far too long. This man wasn't just standing up for himself, he was holding a mirror up to the entire organization. But how did it get to this point? What drove him to speak out in such a bold, unexpected way? It wasn't always like this. When he first started, he had high hopes for the job. The company had presented itself as progressive, inclusive, a place where talent and hard work mattered more than anything else. He believed he could make a difference, bring fresh ideas, and contribute to the growth of the business. But that illusion quickly shattered within the first few weeks. At first, the microaggressions were subtle, almost easy to brush off. A passing comment about how impressive it was that he had made it this far. A joke about diversity hires at the water cooler. Small things that, taken alone, seemed insignificant but added up over time. He had dealt with this kind of behavior before, and though it stung, he had learned to let it slide. After all, it wasn't the first time he had been the only black man in the room. But then it got worse. The more he tried to contribute, the more resistance he faced. He would bring ideas to meetings, only to have them shot down without explanation. Or worse, later repackaged and presented by someone else as their own. Tasks that should have been simple were made unnecessarily difficult for him. Resources were mysteriously unavailable when he needed them, yet others seemed to have no problem getting what they needed. It was as if the entire system had been designed to make him fail. His colleagues were no better. They avoided working with him unless they had no other choice. And when they did, they were cold, distant, making it clear that they didn't see him as one of them. Conversations would stop when he entered the room, only to resume in hushed tones after he left. He couldn't help but feel the weight of their judgment, their assumptions about who he was and what he was capable of. Still, he kept going. He worked harder, stayed longer hours, and pushed himself to prove that he belonged. But no matter how much effort he put in, it never seemed to be enough. They were determined to keep him in a box, to make sure he never rose above the position they had mentally assigned him the moment he walked through the door. The breaking point came when he discovered that the company had no intention of letting him succeed. A co-worker, one of the few who wasn't openly hostile, confided in him one evening after everyone else had left. Apparently, there had been conversations behind closed doors from the very beginning. Management had decided that hiring him was more of a PR move than anything else. They didn't expect him to last, and they certainly didn't plan on giving him any real power or influence. He was there for show, a token hire to make the company look good on paper. It was then that he realized he wasn't just facing personal prejudice, he was up against a system designed to keep people like him out. And that's when something in him shifted. He had spent his whole life working twice as hard, jumping through hoops, just to get half the recognition. But this time, he wasn't going to play by their rules anymore. If they wanted him to fail, he would do the exact opposite. Not only would he succeed, but he would make sure that everyone knew exactly what had been going on behind the scenes. So, he quietly prepared. He didn't let on that he knew about the plot against him. Instead, he started paying closer attention, documenting every slight, every unfair action, every time someone tried to undermine him. He took notes, saved emails, and made sure he had evidence of the discrimination he faced. All the while, he continued doing his job to the best of his ability, never letting them see that he was planning something bigger. And then came the day of the presentation, the perfect opportunity for them to set him up for public failure. They thought they were being clever, giving him an impossible task at the last minute, hoping he would stumble. But they didn't realize he had already been preparing for this moment. He had anticipated their moves, had done the work in advance, and was ready for whatever they threw at him. As he delivered that flawless presentation, the looks on their faces said it all. They were shocked, speechless, caught off guard by his competence, his professionalism, and his calm composure. but they had no idea what was coming next. And that's where the real shock came. By the time he finished speaking and turned the spotlight back on the company's toxic culture, no one in the room knew what to say. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about how the entire system was designed to exclude people like him. He wasn't asking for pity or special treatment. He was demanding fairness, accountability, and change. He made it clear that he wasn't going to back down, and that he wouldn't let this continue without exposing the truth. What happened after that meeting would change everything. But before we get there, let's go back and take a deeper look at how this all started. The air in the boardroom was heavy with tension as everyone tried to process what had just happened. No one had expected him to stand up for himself like that, least of all in front of the company's top executives. Some of the people in the room looked uncomfortable, their faces flushed, as if they had been caught doing something they knew was wrong. Others sat frozen, too shocked to react. But the man who had been humiliated, belittled, and set up to fail had just turned the tables in a way that no one had seen coming. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. He could feel the weight of all the eyes on him, but he stood tall, unshaken. They had underestimated him, assumed that he would crumble under pressure, but instead he had used their own game against them. Now, the company had no choice but to face the uncomfortable truth about what had been happening right under their noses, or in some cases, with their full knowledge. But as he left the boardroom that day, something gnawed at him. While the shock in their faces was satisfying, he knew this battle was far from over. Calling them out in that meeting had been the first step, but the real fight was just beginning. The system was too deeply ingrained, and he knew that they wouldn't go down without a fight. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the office shifted. There was an uneasy silence whenever he walked by, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Some of his colleagues avoided him entirely, as if associating with him might somehow make them a target. Others, people who had always stayed neutral, suddenly seemed a little more interested in what he had to say, as if they were starting to question the status quo themselves. But the higher-ups, they weren't going to let this go without a response. It started subtly. Tasks that had been manageable before suddenly became much more difficult. Requests for resources were delayed, emails went unanswered, and his workload doubled overnight. It was clear that they were trying to push him to the edge, to make him feel like speaking out had been a mistake. But he didn't back down. He had expected this, prepared for it even, and now it was just a matter of seeing how far they would go. And then came the second twist, one that he hadn't seen coming. One afternoon, as he was going over some documents, he received an email from someone he had never interacted with before, a whistleblower inside the company. The email was short and cryptic, but it contained a few key pieces of information that changed everything. Apparently, the discrimination he had faced wasn't just the work of a few bad actors. It was part of a larger, more organized effort that stretched beyond just him. According to the whistleblower, there had been other employees before him, people of color, women, anyone who didn't fit the company's mold, who had been hired only to be systematically pushed out. The company had a pattern of creating a hostile environment for certain groups. And then when they inevitably left or were forced out, management would claim that they had been given a fair chance, but just couldn't cut it. The email included internal documents, memos, meeting notes, and emails between executives that confirmed what the whistleblower was saying. It was all part of a calculated strategy to keep the company's image looking diverse on the outside, while ensuring that real power and opportunities remained in the hands of a select few. The higher-ups had known all along what was going on, and they were complicit in it. This new information hit him like a ton of bricks. He had suspected that something larger was at play, but seeing it laid out so clearly was a shock. The company's entire image as an inclusive, progressive workplace was built on a lie. And now he had the proof. But with this new knowledge came a heavy burden. What was he supposed to do with it? Going public with the information could expose the company and force them to answer for their actions, but it would also mean putting himself in the crosshairs again, only this time the stakes would be much higher. The company wasn't going to let this kind of information leak out without a fight, and they would do everything in their power to discredit him if he tried. As he sat there, staring at the email, he felt the weight of the decision in front of him. He could continue fighting from within, hoping that things would change, or he could blow the whistle and risk everything. Either way, the road ahead was dangerous. Over the next few days, he carefully weighed his options. He reached out to the whistleblower, but they were cautious, offering only small pieces of information at a time. They were clearly scared, and for good reason. If they were discovered, their career would be over, and they had no guarantee of protection. But they believed in the importance of exposing the truth, and so did he. The more he learned, the more he realized just how deep the corruption went. It wasn't just about individual acts of racism or sexism. It was a system designed to keep certain people out of power while maintaining the illusion of diversity. And the higher he looked, the more he realized that some of the very people who had smiled in his face and welcomed him to the company had been part of the plan all along. But the twist didn't end there. Just as he was about to make his next move, something unexpected happened. The company tried to buy him out. One morning, he was called into a meeting with the top executives. They were all there, the same people who had been in the boardroom during his presentation, the same people who had been quietly working against him from the start. But this time, they weren't smug or dismissive. They were nervous. The CEO, who had barely spoken to him before, led the conversation. They offered him a promotion, a raise, and a glowing recommendation, everything he had been working toward, if he agreed to stay quiet and drop any further accusations. They didn't say it outright, but the message was clear. They were trying to buy his silence. For a moment, he was tempted. After everything he had been through, the thought of walking away with a promotion, more money, and his reputation intact was appealing. But deep down, he knew that taking the deal would mean betraying everything he had fought for. It would mean letting the company continue with its toxic practices, letting other people go through the same thing he had. And so, he refused. The look on their faces when he said no was one of shock, followed by thinly veiled anger. They had expected him to fold, to take the easy way out, just like so many before him. But now that he had refused their offer, they knew they had a real problem on their hands. As he walked out of that meeting, he knew that the fight was far from over. In fact, it had just escalated to a whole new level. The company was going to come after him with everything they had. They would try to ruin his reputation, destroy his career, and make sure that no one ever took him seriously again. But he was ready. He had the proof, and he wasn't going to back down. What he didn't know, though, was that there was still one more twist coming, something that would change the game completely, and not in the way anyone expected. As he left that final meeting, the gravity of what lay ahead weighed on him. The air outside felt heavy, thick with the impending battle that he knew was coming. He could feel it in the way people glanced at him, in the whispers that followed him down the hallway. Everyone seemed to know that something big was happening, but no one knew exactly what. The company was a ticking time bomb, and he held the detonator in his hand. The days that followed were tense. The pressure mounted from all sides. The higher-ups had made their intentions clear. They weren't going to back down. He began noticing little things, files that went missing, calls that mysteriously dropped, and subtle threats disguised as casual comments. He knew they were trying to intimidate him, to make him think twice about continuing his fight. But every time they pushed, it only strengthened his resolve. He spent long hours preparing. He knew he needed to be strategic about how he exposed the company's corruption. It wasn't enough to just have the evidence he needed to make sure that when the truth came out, it couldn't be buried. He began reaching out to journalists, lawyers, and advocates for workplace rights. Some were hesitant to get involved at first. The company was powerful, after all, and no one wanted to get on their bad side. But as he showed them the documents, as he laid out the pattern of discrimination and manipulation, people started to take notice. Slowly, a network of support began to form around him. But the company wasn't idle during this time. They were gearing up for their own attack. And when they finally struck, they hit hard. One morning, as he arrived at work, he was met with the news. The company had launched an internal investigation against him. The claims were vague, but damaging enough to cast doubt on his character. They accused him of misconduct, of misusing company resources, and of creating a hostile work environment for his colleagues. It was a classic move turn the accuser into the accused. The smear campaign was brutal. The media caught wind of it, and soon articles began circulating, painting him as a disgruntled employee who was trying to take down the company out of spite. Anonymous sources from within the company provided quotes about how difficult he had been to work with, how he had always been combative and insubordinate. It was clear that the company had orchestrated this attack to discredit him before he could go public with the truth. But despite the smear campaign, he kept his head down and continued preparing. He had anticipated this move, and he wasn't going to let it derail his plans. With the help of his lawyer, he filed a counterclaim, accusing the company of retaliation and defamation. It wasn't long before both sides were entrenched in a legal battle that was rapidly gaining attention. As the court date approached, tensions were at an all-time high. Both sides knew that everything hinged on the outcome of this case. The company had deep pockets and an army of high-powered lawyers, but he had something they didn't. He had the truth. And as the trial unfolded, it became clear that the company's carefully constructed FAAD was beginning to crumble. Witness after witness was called to testify. Former employees, people who had faced similar treatment, came forward with stories that mirrored his own. Some spoke of being passed over for promotions despite being the most qualified. Others detailed how they had been subjected to hostile work environments until they were forced to quit. The pattern of discrimination that he had uncovered was laid bare for all to see. And then came the whistleblower. After months of remaining in the shadows, they finally took the stand. Their testimony was damning. They revealed internal communications between executives, emails that discussed strategies for pushing certain employees out of the company. The jury listened intently as the whistleblower described how the company had deliberately set up people like him to fail, all while maintaining the appearance of diversity and inclusion. The courtroom was silent as the final piece of evidence was presented, a memo from one of the company's top executives, outlining how they planned to use employees like him as a token to satisfy diversity quotas, while ensuring that they never gained real power within the company. It was the smoking gun, the proof that everything he had claimed was true. When the verdict finally came, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The jury found in his favor. The company was ordered to pay a significant settlement for the discrimination, retaliation, and defamation they had caused. But more than that, they were forced to make sweeping changes to their policies and practices. The victory was sweet, but it wasn't just about the money. It was about exposing the truth and making sure that no one else would have to go through what he had endured. As the news of the verdict spread, people began reaching out to him. Journalists wanted to tell his story. Activists wanted to collaborate, and other employees who had been wronged by the company felt empowered to come forward. His bravery had sparked a movement, one that was shining a light on the toxic practices that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. But just when it seemed like the story was over, one final twist emerged, something that no one could have predicted. A few months after the trial, he received an anonymous tip. It came in the form of a plain, unmarked envelope, slipped under his door one evening. Inside was a single piece of paper, along with a USB drive. The note was short and cryptic. "There's more. They're not done. This goes higher than you think." Intrigued, he plugged the USB drive into his computer. What he found on it shook him to his core. It contained files, confidential documents that linked the company to a much larger network of corruption. The company he had just taken down was merely one piece of a much bigger puzzle. There were other corporations involved, working together to maintain the same discriminatory practices across multiple industries. The whole thing was far more organized and widespread than he had ever imagined. He realized that his fight wasn't over. The company might have been exposed, but there were others out there, operating under the same toxic systems. And now, he had the information to take them down. As he stared at the screen, processing what he had just uncovered, he felt a familiar mix of fear and determination. He knew what he had to do. The battle ahead was going to be even bigger than the one he had just fought, but he was ready. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, marginalized, or pushed out of the workplace because they didn't fit the mold. This time, he wasn't going to stop until the whole system came crashing down. The story that had begun with a single act of humiliation had now turned into something far greater. It was no longer just about him or his personal experience. It was about exposing the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. And with this new information in his hands, he was prepared to take the fight to the next level. The final twist wasn't just a revelation about the company, it was a revelation about the world he had been living in all along. A world where power was concentrated in the hands of a few, and anyone who didn't fit their vision was expendable. But now, he had the chance to change that. The story wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. And this time, the stakes were even higher. In the weeks that followed, he found himself consumed by the magnitude of what he had uncovered. The files on the USB drive were far more than just a lead. They were a detailed roadmap of corruption, with names, companies, and strategies, all laid out in a web of deceit that stretched across industries. It was clear now that the company he had taken down wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a larger, more sinister network. And with this new information, he knew he couldn't stop. There were people counting on him, whether they knew it or not. The decision weighed heavy on him. After everything he had been through, the idea of taking on something even bigger felt daunting. He had already sacrificed so much: his peace of mind, his reputation, his sense of normalcy. But at the same time, the thought of walking away now, of letting this corruption continue unchecked, wasn't an option. The system was broken, and he had the chance to fix it, or at least take the first steps toward doing so. He began working quietly, assembling a team of trusted allies who could help him navigate this new fight. Some were the same journalists, lawyers, and activists who had stood by him during the trial. Others were new faces, people who had their own reasons for wanting to see justice done. They worked late into the nights, combing through the files, connecting the dots, and preparing for the inevitable fallout that would come when they went public with what they had discovered. And then the day came. With the support of his team, he released the information to the public in a carefully orchestrated move. Major media outlets ran the story, exposing the widespread corruption that had been hidden in plain sight for years. The backlash was immediate and fierce. CEOs, board members, and high-ranking officials scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, but the evidence was undeniable. Lawsuits were filed, companies were investigated, and some of the most powerful players in the corporate world were suddenly being held accountable for their actions. It was chaos, but it was the kind of chaos that brought change. People began speaking out, sharing their own stories of discrimination, harassment, and abuse of power. The system that had kept so many marginalized and silenced was finally being called into question. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope. He had started something much bigger than himself, something that could actually make a difference. But even as the dust settled and justice began to take its course, there was still one question that lingered in his mind. Who had sent him the USB drive? The note had been anonymous. the tip coming from the shadows, and no one had come forward to claim responsibility. He had his theories, of course. Maybe it had been a disgruntled employee from one of the companies implicated in the files, or perhaps it was someone on the inside who had grown tired of the corruption and wanted to see it exposed. But whoever it was, they had given him the key to unlock a much larger truth. He didn't dwell on it for too long, though. There were more important things to focus on, things like rebuilding his life after the whirlwind of the past year. The fight had been exhausting, both physically and emotionally, and he knew he needed to take time to heal. But even as he stepped away from the spotlight, the movement he had helped ignite continued to grow. People were demanding more transparency, more accountability, and real change in the way businesses operated. The ripple effects were felt across industries. Companies that had once operated with impunity were now being scrutinized like never before. Some were forced to change their policies, while others were dismantled entirely. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and there was still so much work to be done, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all you can hope for. In the end, the story of one man's fight against a corrupt company had become something far greater. It had become a symbol of resistance, of standing up against injustice, no matter the cost. And while the journey had been painful and full of unexpected twists, he wouldn't have changed a thing. Because through it all, he had found something more valuable than anything else. He had found his voice. And now, there was no turning back. As he walked through the city one evening, reflecting on everything that had happened, he couldn't help but smile. The world felt different now. Lighter, somehow. The air wasn't so thick with tension anymore, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. There would always be more battles to fight, more corruption to expose. But for now, he could rest knowing that he had made a difference, that he had taken on a system that had tried to break him, and he had won. Just as he was about to head home, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down at the screen, expecting another message from one of his colleagues or a reporter wanting an update on the latest developments. But it wasn't either of those things. It was a new email from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line was simple, just 2 words, "Well done." A chill ran down his spine as he opened the email. It was short, only a few lines long, but the message was clear. You did what needed to be done. But don't get comfortable. This was only the beginning. He stared at the screen for a moment, his mind racing with possibilities. Who was behind this? Was it the same person who had sent the USB drive? Or was it someone else, someone with even more knowledge of the corruption that still lurked in the shadows? As he stood there, phone in hand, he realized that the fight was far from over. There were still more secrets to uncover, more people to hold accountable. And now, with this new message, he knew that someone out there was watching him, someone who understood just how deep the rot went. But instead of fear, he felt a sense of resolve. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to stop now. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready for them. Because now, he knew the power of the truth. And no matter how hard they tried to hide it, the truth would always come out in the end. With that thought, he slipped his phone back into his pocket and continued walking. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the sounds of life hummed around him. It was a new beginning, one he hadn't asked for, but had embraced nonetheless. And as he disappeared into the night, one thing was certain: the world would never be the same again.